The air hung heavy in the pre-dawn forest. It tasted of copper and damp earth, a coppery tang from spilled blood mingling with the rich, decaying scent of the woods. Adrenaline, a phantom presence that coiled tight in their guts for hours, slowly dissipated, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and aches in places they hadn't known could ache. 5 figures stood amidst the carnage, silhouetted against the first hint of gray light filtering through the dense canopy. They were hunters, veterans of countless grim nights, but this one had pushed them to the edge. At their feet lay 2 massive, grotesquely twisted bodies, werewolves. They were the culmination of a grueling, brutal fight that nearly cost them everything. Their forms, now still and lifeless, were testament to the savagery they had overcome. Matted fur soaked with dark fluid, limbs bent at impossible angles, maws permanently locked in silent snarls. Victor stood slightly apart, his broad shoulders slumped, but his gaze remained sharp. He methodically checked the binds on his left forearm, wincing slightly at the fresh rip in the reinforced leather and the burn beneath. His face, usually set in determined lines, was smudged with dirt and sweat, but his eyes held a weary satisfaction. They had done it. The job was finished. Exhaustion claimed Ethan, yet his breathing remained ragged as he leaned heavily against the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak. The head of his custom-forged axe, its edge stained dark, rested on the mossy ground beside him. He ran a gloved hand through his sweat-soaked hair, his face pale beneath the grime. His grip on the axe haft remained firm. Silas moved with almost unnatural quiet, a shadow flitting along the perimeter. His movements were fluid, his eyes scanning the tree line, alert for threats. He held a long, wickedly sharp silver knife, its blade reflecting the nascent light dully. His expression was unreadable as always, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes about the strain he endured. David knelt near the remains of their temporary camp, meticulously inventorying what little remained of their supplies. Vials containing potent herbal concoctions clinked softly as he rearranged them in his pack. His spectacles were slightly askew on his nose, and a thin line of blood ran down his cheek from a shallow gash. He moved with a scholar's precision, a stark contrast to the brute force of the battle, yet his hands, stained and calloused, knew the weight of a silver round just as well as a fragile ancient text. Aaron sat huddled near a rock, his arms wrapped around his knees. He trembled, not just from the chill of the forest air, but from the lingering shock of the fight. His face was stark white, and his eyes, wide and haunted, gazed vacantly at the gruesome scene before them. A faint sound, halfway between a sob and a sigh, escaped his lips. He was utterly broken, barely holding himself together. He was the newest, the least hardened among them, and the horror of the night had taken a heavy toll. The next task was grim but essential: collecting trophies. This was not gratuitous mutilation. It was proof. Proof for their unseen employers that the contract had been fulfilled, the monsters dispatched. Specialized tools were drawn: bone saws, heavy-duty clippers, bags lined with treated canvas. They worked quickly, efficiently, a practiced, brutal ballet that contrasted sharply with the primal chaos of the battle they had just survived. Claws the size of a man's hand were severed, razor-sharp fangs pried from slack jaws, patches of thick, dark fur carefully peeled away. Victor oversaw the process, his expression purely pragmatic. This was business. Survival depended on getting paid, and getting paid depended on providing undeniable evidence. Ethan, despite his exhaustion, handled the heaviest cuts with his axe. Silas worked with surgical precision, his knife finding the joints and sinews with minimal effort. David cataloged the pieces, noting species specifics, known alchemical uses, and estimated weight for transport. Aaron, however, averted his gaze. His stomach rebelled against the gruesome task. He offered weak protests, but eventually, grudgingly helped hold bags or clean tools. His movements were hesitant and clearly distressed. It was a necessary routine for hunters, a stark reminder that their lives were built on ending others, no matter how monstrous. A quick inventory of their remaining gear revealed their precarious state. Silver rounds, the bane of werewolves, were down to a handful each. Blessed knives were nicked and bent, their edges dulled from countless parries against bone and claw. Herbal poultices and alchemical salves were almost entirely depleted. They had thrown everything they had into this fight. Just enough remained for the journey back, barely enough for a small skirmish if one proved unavoidable, certainly not for another prolonged engagement. They were vulnerable, wounded, and running on fumes, even before whatever had trapped them made its presence known. Their survival now depended on a swift, unimpeding retreat. "All right," Victor said, his voice rough but steady. "Ethan, you take the larger hides. Silas, the fangs and claws. David, you handle the smaller biologicals. Check the perimeter again when you're done. Aaron, help David secure the packs." He looked at each of them in turn. "Good work tonight? We're pulling out." The map indicated a 10-mile trek west. They planned to arrive at the logging road by midday. Brief nods of acknowledgement followed. Short, clipped sentences confirmed roles, plans. A brief, almost fleeting sense of shared accomplishment settled over them, a sliver of safety found in their temporary survival and the promise of rest and reward. David consulted a folded topographical map, tracing a line with a grimy finger. 10 miles west. "We aimed for the road by midday." Silas pointed towards a dense thicket. "The best path is through there. It avoids the ridge." Ethan hefted a rolled hide onto his shoulder, testing the weight. "Heavy, but I can manage." Aaron simply nodded, eyes still wide, clearly desperate to put distance between himself and the dead things at their feet. As they prepared to move, subtle details pricked at the edges of Victor's awareness. The forest was too quiet. No birdsong, not even the buzzing of insects, which should have been out in force with the rising damp. An unnatural mist crept in, thicker and faster than was typical for this time of morning, wrapping tendrils around the trees. Shadows clung too tightly to the ground, shifting at the periphery of vision. He checked his compass. The needle quivered erratically, refusing to settle on north. He frowned, tapping the glass. "Damn thing's acting up," he muttered, stuffing it back in his pocket. He attributed it to residual magic from the den, thinking it screwed with magnetic fields. It was a plausible explanation, one he accepted readily, filing away the unease for later. They broke camp, leaving the gruesome remains behind. Their pace was tired but driven. Every fiber of their beings urged them away from this place of death and horror. They followed Silas's suggested path, weaving through the dense undergrowth, the air growing heavier with the encroaching mist. The sky remained stubbornly stuck in a perpetual twilight, the sun refusing to crest the horizon. It was unusual, and they attributed it to thick cloud cover or the density of the forest. It was not enough to spark true panic, just another oddity in a place filled with them. An hour passed, then another. By their reckoning, they had covered at least 2 miles, putting significant distance between themselves and the kill site. But the forest felt unchanged. The same twisted oaks, the same moss-covered boulders. Then Victor saw it. A unique twin-trunked pine they had used as a marker when setting up their initial camp. Then further back, the faint, unmistakable outline of the rock where Aaron had been huddled. Disbelief washed over him, cold and sharp. "Hold up," Victor said, his voice tight. "Does this look familiar?" Ethan stopped, squinting through the mist. Silas went absolutely still. David adjusted his glasses, scanning the surroundings. Aaron just looked confused. "No way," Ethan breathed. "We should be miles from here." They checked the compasses again, still spinning wildly useless. David pulled out the map, trying to orient it using the sun, but the light was too diffuse, the sky too gray. He tried matching terrain features, but the map contradicted the reality around them. "We're back," Silas stated flatly, his voice devoid of emotion, which only made it more chilling. "We came back." Confusion gave way to irritation, then a cold dread. They picked a different direction, striking out with more determination, pushing their exhausted bodies harder. Another hour passed. The mist thickened. The silence of the forest pressed in on them. And they were back, again. The same twisted pine, the same marked stone. The remnants of the battle were clearer now, visible through the thinning mist. It was not disorientation. It was not a mistake. A terrifying realization dawned. They were not lost. They were trapped. The sickening confirmation came swiftly after their third, increasingly desperate attempt to find an exit. They chose a cardinal direction, arbitrary now that the compasses were useless, and pushed forward, ignoring the fatigue clawing at their muscles. David tried using the angle of the light in the sky, faint as it was, combined with the direction of moss growth on trees, crude, unreliable methods in a place that felt subtly wrong. But every path, regardless of bearing, eventually looped them back to the same point. The kill site, eerily preserved by the unnatural stillness of the air. The forest around them shifted and changed, yet remained stubbornly the same. Trees that appeared unique proved to be replicated clones further along the non-path. Rock formations appeared familiar, then subtly shifted, subtly different. The landscape folded in on itself, a cruel Escher print rendered in mist and pine. The feeling of disorientation intensified, curdling into claustrophobia. The woods, once a place of dangerous work but understandable rules, had become a hostile, illogical maze. Victor, his frustration boiling over into reckless desperation, ordered them to push through what felt like the boundary of the trap. They chose a direction that felt intuitively out and advanced, side by side through the thick woods. As they neared an invisible threshold, the air grew heavy, thick like wading through water. A strange static charge built, making the hairs on their arms stand on end. A low hum resonated in their bones, not heard with the ears, but felt deep within. Aaron cried out first, stumbling back. "It burns!" he gasped, clutching at his skin. A faint red rash spread across his exposed forearms. Ethan felt a sudden sharp pain in his head, like an ice pick driving behind his eyes. David felt dizzy, nauseous, the world tilting around him. Silas merely paused, his eyes narrowing, his hand instinctively going to the silver hilt at his belt. Victor pushed forward, forcing himself against the unseen resistance, feeling a crushing pressure on his chest, his vision blurring at the edges. It was not a physical wall, not a force field they could see. It was something that attacked the body's very fabric, a magical or metaphysical barrier designed not to break bones, but to break wills, to repel them with agony. They retreated, panting, backs pressed against trees that felt too solid, too permanent. The barrier was real, and it was absolute. The next grim discovery cemented their isolation. Victor pulled out his satellite phone, a bulky, expensive piece of gear designed for remote communication. No signal, just a flat, dead tone. Ethan tried his two-way radio, only static, a mournful hiss that mocked their predicament. David's small, battery-powered shortwave receiver picked up nothing but gibberish. Aaron fumbled with his cell phone, though they all knew it was useless out here anyway. 0 bars. Nothing. They were utterly cut off. No beacon could be sent. No call for help could escape this invisible prison. No one outside knew where they were, or that they were trapped. The realization landed with the weight of a physical blow. They were alone. Alone in a hostile forest with dwindling supplies, and something that could twist space itself holding them captive. The fear of the trap was quickly joined by the crushing dread of absolute isolation. As the perpetual twilight deepened into a semblance of night, they were forced to make camp. This time, the choice of location felt less like a strategic decision and more like a concession to the inevitable. They chose a small clearing, defensible enough, but the sense of security was a thin veneer over a churning pit of anxiety. Tension was a palpable thing, thick in the air like the mist. They organized a watch rotation, but every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of nervous energy through the group. The campfire they built burned brightly, casting dancing shadows that writhed at the edge of the light. It offered warmth, a small comfort against the chill, but it also felt like a beacon, drawing the attention of whatever intelligence had woven this cage around them. Aaron's trembling was constant now, a visible manifestation of the group's unspoken terror. It was contagious, a tremor of fear that passed between them whenever their eyes met. David, his face grim, pulled out his satchel of ancient texts. Bound in worn leather, filled with brittle yellowed pages covered in cramped script. These were his source of knowledge on the arcane, the monstrous, the things that existed outside the understanding of modern science. He spread them out near the firelight, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered to himself, flipping through pages, his voice a low drone against the crackling fire. He spoke of cursed lands, reality distortions, convergence points, powerful rights. His studies led him to consider an entity capable of subjugating space responsible. His knowledge, usually a source of quiet confidence and guidance, now only served to confirm the terrifying scale of their predicament. The trap was not a natural phenomenon. It was deliberate. And by the look of his texts, it was infinitely old and powerful. The forest itself became an active participant in their torment. Trees pressed too close, their branches like grasping fingers reaching from the perpetual gloom. Sounds were distorted. The rustle of leaves sounded like mocking whispers. The distant hoot of an owl echoed with an unnatural resonance. The feeling of being watched was constant, a prickling sensation on the back of their necks. It was not just passive nature. It was a hostile environment, part of the mechanism holding them prisoner, amplifying their fear, playing on their frayed nerves. The collective mood plummeted from simple frustration to a deep, gnawing anxiety, a terrifying premonition of disaster. Exhaustion was replaced by a frantic, nervous energy that made rest impossible. They were trapped, cut off, and the darkness felt like it was closing in. The first night in the cage was a long, agonizing vigil, filled with unseen sounds, shifting shadows, and the dawning, horrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. The second morning arrived, not with the soft light of dawn, but with the same murky, oppressive twilight that had enveloped them since they had been trapped. The hunters rose from fitful, nightmare-haunted sleep, stiff and unrested. They checked their perimeter, eyes scanning the motionless trees, searching for any sign of movement in the night. The tension of the previous night had not dissipated. It had solidified into a cold, hard knot in each of their chests. It was Silas who found him. He had been making a wider sweep than usual. His tracker's instinct sensed something amiss. He returned to their small, wary camp, his face uncharacteristically pale under the grime. "Ethan," he said, his voice flat. "Found Ethan." Victor was instantly alert. "Where? Is he all right?" Silas just shook his head, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. He led them, not back towards the trap's supposed edge, but deeper into the woods, perhaps 100 yards from their fire. The path was broken, leaves disturbed. Something heavy had been dragged. The air here felt colder, stiller, and then they saw him. Ethan. The sight stole their breath, gagged them with horror. His body was horrifically mauled, sprawled near the base of a massive oak. His throat was torn open, a gaping wound from which dark, viscous blood still seeped into the leaf litter. His chest had been ripped apart, organs brutally exposed. The sheer, animalistic savagery of the attack was unmistakable. There were traces of immense force, bone fragments splintered, flesh rent asunder. "By God," Aaron whimpered, his voice trembling. Victor knelt, forcing himself to examine the body. The wounds were unlike anything they had inflicted on the werewolves they had killed. Those had been death blows, precise applications of silver. These were something else, more frenzied, more bestial. He looked at the bite marks on the throat, the depth and spread of the puncture wounds. They were massive, larger than any wolf, larger even than the werewolves they had just put down. And the tearing, it spoke of claws, thick and sharp, driven by terrifying strength. No, Aaron whimpered, stumbling back, covering his mouth with a shaking hand. "It can't be. We killed them all." Disbelief warred with the undeniable evidence before their eyes. It was the work of a werewolf. There was no mistaking the signature brutality. But how? They had killed the pair that had terrorized the region. They had taken the trophies. They had confirmed the kills. Terrifying possibilities arose. They considered a third werewolf they had not known about, or the impossible survival of one they had killed, returning for vengeance. The possibilities were terrifying, but one thought began to creep in, cold and insidious, pushing aside the others. The chilling thought solidified. The killer was already among them. The first glances, quick and furtive, passed between the surviving three. Eyes darted, lingering for just a fraction of a second too long on a face, a pair of hands. A silent, suffocating question hung in the air between them. "Was it you?" They looked at their own hands, searching for unseen scratches, unexplained bloodstains. Old scars, relics of past hunts, took on sinister new possibilities in their minds. They re-examined old scars, like the deep gash on Silas's thigh he claimed came from a bear trap. A chilling question arose. What if it hadn't been from a bear trap? Victor eyed Silas. Every movement, every silence now felt laden with potential threat. He wondered if his scouting trips had been cover. Silas, in turn, watched Victor, questioning if the leader's rigid control and quick temper were the strain of hiding a terrible secret. Aaron, trembling uncontrollably, appeared incapable of such violence. Yet his abject fear felt almost performative in its intensity. They questioned if his abject fear was a mask. Every past interaction, every moment of shared danger, was replayed, scrutinized for any hint of something missed, something hidden. Everyone suddenly was a suspect. Victor stood, his earlier weariness replaced by a rigid control. His face was hard. "All right," he said, his voice dangerously low. "What happened last night? Who was on watch when? Where were you, each of you, when this happened?" He tried to impose order, to bring his authority to bear on the chaos, but his demands felt different now. Not like leadership, but like an interrogation. Like he was already looking for flaws, for lies. Silas remained silent, his gaze sweeping the surrounding woods. His stillness, his ability to move without a sound, which had always made him their invaluable scout and tracker, now felt deeply unsettling. His watchfulness felt menacing. Victor watched him, questions burning in his mind. What had Silas seen? What was he not saying? Aaron was openly weeping now, his body racked with sobs. He sank to the ground, burying his face in his hands. His panic, once merely irritating, now felt suspicious. Victor and Silas watched Aaron, seeing his fear as a possible performance. Could anyone truly be that scared? His abject fear made him appear incapable, a picture of pure victimhood. But the horrifying alternative was clear. His fear provided the perfect cover. They ran through the events of the past few days, their minds racing, replaying past events. They considered the possibility that one of them had been bitten earlier in a previous hunt and hid the wound. They knew werewolf bites were infectious, transformative. The change often took days, even weeks, triggered by stress, fear, or the dark of the moon. But the moon remained hidden behind the perpetual twilight. They considered another possibility. One of the werewolves they had killed had managed to inflict a fatal, transformative bite before dying. The most horrifying thought solidified. One of them had not been fully human all along. One of their own, a trusted comrade, had been a werewolf, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trap had isolated them. Now the murders were tearing them apart from the inside. Trust, the bedrock of their survival, had just been shattered into 1,000 bloody pieces. The grim process of examining each other began almost immediately after they managed to drag Ethan's mutilated body away from the immediate vicinity of the camp, not for burial, which felt impossible in their current state, but simply to remove the horrifying spectacle. Victor, his face a mask of grim determination, ordered it. "We check each other," he stated, his voice brokering no argument, yet laced with an undercurrent of desperation. Arms, necks, backs. Any fresh wounds. The inspection was tense, uncomfortable, and utterly devoid of the camaraderie they had once shared. Each person submitted to the scrutiny with a mixture of resentment and fearful compliance. Shirts were pulled back, sleeves rolled up. Hands were turned over, palms and knuckles examined. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Silas stood impassive, allowing Victor to briefly look over his arms. His skin was a roadmap of old scars, knife cuts, rope burns, faded claw marks from past encounters. All were accounted for, or so Victor remembered. But doubt gnawed at him. Had he missed something? Silas's eyes, steady and unblinking, offered no clues, which in itself felt suspicious. Aaron flinched away when Victor reached for him, his fear evident, almost overwhelming. Victor had to speak sharply for him to cooperate. Aaron's body was a patchwork of smaller injuries, scrapes and bruises from falls and clumsy movements during the fight. No deep wounds, nothing that looked remotely like a bite or a serious claw mark. His skin was pale and clammy. He appeared physically incapable of inflicting the damage seen on Ethan. Yet the utter lack of significant injury was almost as suspicious as finding one would have been. How could the weakest among them have survived the previous night's brutal fight unscathed? They scrutinized old scars anew, their memories distorted by fear. That deep gash on Silas's thigh, which he had claimed was from a bear trap, a chilling question arose. What if every past vulnerability, every shared infirmity, became fuel for suspicion? The unspoken distrust quickly manifested physically. They could no longer stand to be close. When they returned to the camp area, they did not huddle together for warmth or comfort. Instead, they spread out. Victor took a spot near the main fire pit. Silas moved further back, choosing a place shielded by dense brush, his back to a large rock. Aaron retreated to the fringes, finding a place near the trees, curled up on himself. The camp fractured, physically reflecting the tearing of their bonds. Weapons were kept close, hands resting near hilts or pockets containing the precious few silver rounds. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow and guarded. Victor tried to initiate an investigation, falling back on the protocols he knew. He circled the area where Ethan's body was found, looking for tracks and signs of struggle they overlooked in the initial shock. But the ground was covered in leaf litter, damp and disturbed by their own movements. The mist, still clinging to the forest floor, obscured vision. He questioned Silas again, trying to get him to recount his movements during the night watch, looking for inconsistencies. Silas answered in clipped, precise sentences, offering no extraneous details, which Victor found infuriating and suspicious. Victor agonized. Was Silas being truthful or carefully constructing a narrative? Silas's silence, his unnerving ability to move through the woods like a phantom, made him an immediate, potent suspect in the eyes of Victor. Victor believed he could have easily slipped out of camp, committed the murder, and returned undetected. His skills, honed over years as their primary scout and stealth operative, were now twisted into potential weapons against them. Every quiet step he took, every time he disappeared for a moment, fueled their fear. Victor wondered, was Silas merely being cautious, or was he stalking them? Aaron remained the least suspected. His overwhelming fear, his physical fragility, his constant distress, they painted a picture of a victim, not a perpetrator. He appeared too weak, too pathetic, to be a powerful hidden monster. He was a burden, crying and trembling, needing comfort he could not be given. He drew pity, annoyance, but not fear. He was the perfect blind spot. In their desperate search for a cunning, capable killer, they overlooked the possibility that the most vulnerable among them could be the most dangerous. The forest continued its subtle psychological assault. Sounds shifted and warped. The rustling of leaves sounded like footsteps just outside the firelight. Branches creaked like groaning doors. The shadows lengthened and deepened in unnatural ways, possessing a life of their own, darting just out of sight. The constant feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in on their minds, exacerbating their exhaustion and fraying nerves. The world felt alive and hostile, deliberately manipulating their senses, pushing them towards the brink. The trap was not just a physical cage. It was a psychological weapon, amplifying their paranoia, turning their deepest fears against them, and making them ripe for self-destruction. The killer, whoever it was not only hunting them, but also playing a deeper, crueler game with their minds. They stumbled upon false leads, a patch of disturbed earth that looked like a shallow grave but proved to be just tangled roots, a glint of metal that turned out to be a discarded tin can from their own supplies, a strange symbol carved into a tree that was actually just a natural knot in the wood. But in their state, they could not be sure. Was the killer planting these, amplifying their paranoia, reveling in their self-destruction? The thought was almost as terrifying as the physical threat. They were losing their grip on reality, trapped in a maze designed to make them destroy each other. The third morning in the trap arrived, marked by the same suffocating twilight and the chill that had settled deep in their bones. Sleep had been a luxury none could afford, replaced by the constant gnawing fear and the flicker of the dying campfire. They rose stiffly, bodies aching, minds brittle. Their first instinct was to try and break the loop again. They held a fragile hope that the killer had gone, that the trap had weakened. Victor, Silas, and Aaron moved with weary determination, leaving the gruesome clearing and Ethan's hastily moved body behind. David had joined them, his spectacles glinting slightly in the gloom as he consulted his map and compasses, despite knowing they were useless. He held out a fragile hope that his knowledge of celestial navigation or ancient wayfinding might find a flaw in the spatial distortion. "West," Victor muttered, pointing vaguely. "Just keep going west. Hard." They pushed through the undergrowth, eyes scanning the familiar yet subtly alien landscape. The mist was thicker this morning, swirling around their knees, clinging to the trees like burial shrouds. The silence felt deeper, more watchful than ever before. It was Aaron who stumbled upon him. Aaron, lagging slightly behind, let out a choked cry. Victor and Silas spun around, weapons instinctively raised, hearts hammering. Aaron was pointing a trembling finger towards a small, rocky outcrop just off the barely there path. His face, already pale, had gone slack with a fresh wave of horror. "David," Aaron whispered, the sound barely audible. They moved forward, pushing past the shaking man, and then they saw it. David's body was sprawled on the damp earth, twisted into an unnatural shape. His spectacles were gone, lost or broken. The initial cause of death wasn't immediately obvious, unlike Ethan's brutal mauling. There was blood, dark and viscous, but it emanated from numerous smaller wounds, not one catastrophic one. Victor knelt cautiously, Silas covering him, eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. David's face was pale and still. His throat was intact, no bite marks. His chest was not torn open. But his hands were mutilated, fingers bent at impossible angles, raw and bloody, as if they had been crushed or savagely twisted. Scattered around his head, scrawled onto the damp earth with what looked like blood, were strange, complex symbols. Geometric shapes intertwined with esoteric lines, stark and horrifying against the brown earth. They weren't random. They looked deliberate, ancient, pulsing with a faint, unseen malevolence that made the air near David's body feel colder. Victor felt a fresh wave of nausea. This wasn't the work of a mindless beast. This was something targeted, something that went beyond simple killing. David's knowledge, his books. This was a message targeted at David's knowledge, at what he represented. It was a message. A terrifying, personal message. Silas, usually so stoic, looked visibly disturbed by the scene. He knelt opposite Victor, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "What? What are those?" he murmured, his voice rough. Victor shook his head, his mind racing through fragmented pieces of David's muttered lore. "I don't know. Not from any werewolf sign I've ever seen. It looks ritualistic, like something out of David's books." Aaron was whimpering again, backing away slowly, eyes wide with terror. He looked genuinely distraught, the picture of pure, helpless fear. But Victor felt a cold dread settle in his gut. Two dead. One brutally torn apart, the other killed with deliberate, symbolic cruelty. Both deaths were different, yet both felt like the work of something impossibly powerful, impossibly cruel. And the killer was still here, trapped with them. The methods were different, but the source felt the same. He looked from David's body to the symbols, to Silas, whose face was unreadable, and then to Aaron, whose fear was absolute. Two distinct methods of killing. One killer or two. He questioned if something else had entered the trap, or if one of them was responsible for both. The paranoia intensified, twisting into a grotesque, multi-headed monster. David, the scholar, the keeper of arcane knowledge, was gone. Silenced. His hands, capable of turning ancient pages and preparing potent drafts, were destroyed. Whatever had killed him clearly didn't want him to use his knowledge or find a way out. It was a message targeted at his very being. They stood there for a long moment, the mist swirling around David's lifeless form, the blood symbols stark against the earth. The silence of the forest pressed in, no longer merely empty, but expectant, waiting. Victor finally stood, wiping a hand across his grim face. The air felt thinner, colder. The group had just shrunk again. The circle was tightening. Only 3 of them remained now: Victor, Silas, and Aaron. The circle had shrunk to a terrifying minimum. The deaths of Ethan and David had stripped away the illusion of safety in numbers, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone with their fear and their suspicions. The sense of isolation intensified, the crushing weight of their predicament amplified by the absence of their fallen comrades. Each of the remaining 3 was now both a potential victim and, more chillingly, a potential killer. The tension was a physical force, a heavy cloak smothering them. They moved around each other with exaggerated caution, their bodies stiff with mistrust. Speaking was a necessity for coordinating watches, for discussing their next futile move, but every word was strained, laced with unspoken accusations and defensive undertones. The air crackled between Victor and Silas, an almost visible static field of animosity. A single spark, they knew, could ignite a conflagration that would consume them all. Victor continued to assert his authority, clinging to the familiar structure of leadership as a way to impose order on the chaos, or perhaps simply as a way to control his own spiraling fear. "We need a plan," he would say, his voice rough, trying to force a semblance of normalcy. But Silas no longer accepted his authority without question. He moved independently, relying on his own instincts, offering clipped counter-suggestions that bordered on defiance. Their interactions were a fragile dance of fear and necessity, a constant negotiation between the need to cooperate to survive the external threat and the overwhelming suspicion that the greater threat lay within their own small group. Aaron, caught between the two warring men, became increasingly withdrawn. He would hover near one, then the other, seeking a protection that neither could truly offer. More often he would retreat to his solitary spot, curling into a ball, eyes wide and vacant, lost to the overwhelming despair. His helplessness was profound, almost absolute. Their supplies were critically low. A few handfuls of nuts and berries scrounged from the barren forest, a few sips of water each day. Hunger was a constant ache, weakening their bodies and sharpening their desperation. The scarcity fueled their paranoia. A misplaced piece of jerky, a slightly depleted water skin, became another clue, another reason to suspect a comrade of hoarding, of sabotage. The basic need for survival was turning them against each other. Any faint hope of finding a way out had evaporated. They no longer discussed scouting for an exit, no longer attempted to breach the invisible barrier. They knew they were trapped. All their energy, physical and mental, was focused inward, on surviving the night, on avoiding becoming the next victim. The trap was not just a cage. It was an arena, designed to force a confrontation, a horrifying final act. And Aaron remained their blind spot. While Victor and Silas circled each other, locked in their mutual suspicion, Aaron was largely ignored, dismissed as harmless, overwhelmed. Yet under the crushing pressure, subtle cracks appeared in his facade. Moments of unexpected stillness emerged, a strange, sharp gaze that lingered for a second too long before melting back into fearful wide-eyedness, a phrase uttered that felt too coherent, too insightful for someone supposedly lost in panic. These details were missed entirely by Victor and Silas, locked in their deadly dance of suspicion. Aaron's perceived weakness was his most potent weapon, his ultimate camouflage. The most terrifying thing of all was the waiting. Every shadow held potential menace. Every unidentifiable sound was a jolt of terror. They did not know when the killer would strike again, or who would be next. Each night was a fresh torment, a long vigil spent watching and being watched, the forest silent and expectant around them, waiting for the inevitable. Days bled into more days, marked only by the cycle of perpetual twilight and the deepening gnaw of hunger. Victor, his mind increasingly frayed by exhaustion and suspicion, became fixated on finding concrete evidence that Silas was the killer. He could not bear the uncertainty, the waiting. He needed a culprit, a tangible enemy he could confront. His belief that Silas was the werewolf, hiding in plain sight, hardened into a desperate certainty. It was not just suspicion anymore. It was a conviction born of fear and a desperate need for control. He began a more methodical search of the immediate area around their makeshift camp, scrutinizing the ground, the base of trees, any place something could be hidden or dropped. He was searching for a sign, a clue, anything that would unequivocally link Silas to the murders and confirm his monstrous nature. He believed Silas was the only one capable of such silent, brutal efficiency, such cold calculation masked by his quiet demeanor. And then he found it. He was sweeping his hand through a thick layer of damp leaves and pine needles near the cluster of rocks where Silas often chose to rest, a spot just at the edge of the small clearing they occupied. His fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and metallic. Curiosity born of desperation made him dig further. Tucked beneath the decomposing organic matter, partially obscured by a tangled root system as if carelessly or hastily concealed, was a small, irregularly shaped piece of metal. It felt too convenient to simply be lying there. Victor's heart hammered against his ribs as he picked it up. It was silver. Not a coin, not a piece of jewelry, but clearly part of something functional. His mind immediately raced. Was it a shard of a bullet? A fragment from a knife hilt? It was smeared with something dark, blood partially dried. Victor examined it, his fingers tracing the shape. It looked like a piece from one of their own silver rounds, sheared off during a struggle. Or, more damningly, it was from a werewolf, a piece that had been embedded in its flesh. The blood, he concluded, belonged to Ethan or David, and he had found it here not far from where Silas usually slept, tucked away as if deliberately hidden. In his exhausted, paranoid state, the interpretation was instantaneous, undeniable. Silver was anathema to werewolves. This fragment, stained with blood, found so conveniently near Silas, almost as if it had been placed there for him to find. It was proof. It was proof. Silas had been wounded with silver during the attack on Ethan, a wound he had hidden. Or he believed it was proof Silas was somehow connected to the silver used against them, even against David. It was the evidence he needed. The fragmented piece of metal became, in his mind, the smoking gun, the undeniable link. His logic, twisted by the trap and the psychological toll, latched onto this truth with fierce, desperate finality. Silas was the monster. His next thoughts turned immediately to action. He could not wait. Waiting had cost them Ethan and David. He had to act before Silas struck again. He began to plan the confrontation, how best to corner him. When would he be most vulnerable? He dismissed the idea of involving Aaron entirely. Aaron was useless, a liability. This was between him and Silas, between the hunter and the monster hiding among them. He decided the best time would be during Silas's next watch rotation, or just before dawn when exhaustion was at its peak. Silas, throughout this day, remained Silas, quiet, watchful. He spent time sharpening his knife, checking the few remaining traps they had set near the camp. He watched Victor with his usual unnerving intensity. Victor watched Silas, wondering if there was a flicker of awareness in his eyes that Victor was planning something. Was his quietness merely his nature? Or was it the coiled stillness of a predator preparing to spring? Victor saw everything through the lens of his conviction, interpreting Silas's every move as confirmation of his guilt. Silas's calmness appeared like sinister control, his watchfulness like scouting for opportunity. And Aaron? Aaron spent the day much as he had the previous ones, huddled, silent, trembling. He occasionally stirred, perhaps to get a sip of water or huddle closer to the dying embers of the fire. His eyes were still wide, haunted. Yet under that surface of abject terror, the subtle details were there. A strange, almost predatory stillness when he thought no one was looking. A flicker of intelligence in his gaze that contradicted the vacant fear. a subtle shift in his posture that felt less like cowering and more like waiting. These details were missed entirely by Victor and Silas, locked in their deadly dance of suspicion. Aaron's perceived weakness was his most potent weapon, his ultimate camouflage. As the perpetual twilight deepened into a false night, the atmosphere in the camp grew thick with unspoken anticipation. The fire, now little more than embers, cast long dancing shadows that stretched and distorted. The forest, silent and unnaturally still, felt like a vast, expectant audience. The air crackled with a tension that went beyond mere fear. It was the quiet before the storm, the final pull on a tightly wound spring. The scene was set. The players were in place. The inevitable, horrific climax was at hand. The climax arrived not with a sudden attack from the shadows, but with a quiet, deliberate confrontation. Victor, his face set in grim certainty, approached Silas just as the latter was preparing to take the next watch rotation. The air was cold, thick with mist and anticipation. Aaron sat near the dying fire, huddled, his gaze fixed on the embers. "Silas," Victor said, his voice low but carrying an edge of steel. Silas turned, his movements fluid and silent as always. His eyes, visible in the dim light, were alert, wary. "Victor." Victor held out his hand. In his palm lay the small silver fragment smeared with dark blood. "I found this," he stated, his voice hard, "near your spot." Silas's gaze dropped to the silver. His expression remained unreadable for a beat, then a flicker of surprise or confusion crossed his face. "What is it?" "You know what it is," Victor pressed, his conviction absolute. "Silver. And blood." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but the accusation resonated in the still air. "It was you. You killed Ethan. You killed David. You're the one. The werewolf." Silas recoiled slightly, not physically, but as if struck. "What? Are you insane, Victor?" His voice was low, fierce, raw with disbelief. "I would never. Don't lie to me." Victor cut him off, the control he had maintained cracking. "Ethan, torn apart. David, with those symbols. You knew enough about that kind of thing to fake it. And this proves it. You were bitten. Or you are one, hiding amongst us all along. This whole trap, it was you. To pick us off, one by one." Silas stared at him, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and hurt. "You think I did this? After all we've been through? That silver isn't mine. I don't know where you found it, but it's a lie. It's a setup. You're letting the fear get to you, Victor. You're breaking." "I'm not breaking," Victor retorted, his voice rising. "I'm seeing clearly. You're the only one who could move like that, kill like that, hide like that. Your silence, your damn stealth. It was all a cover. And your authority? Your need to control everything?" Silas shot back, his voice rising to match Victor's. "I say it was you, Victor. You're infected, trying to blame me. You killed them in a rage, and you're trying to cover it up." The accusations flew back and forth, venomous, cutting deep, tearing open every wound of doubt and suspicion that the trap had fostered. Years of shared danger, of relying on each other, dissolved in the heat of their mutual distrust. Victor pointed to Silas's unnerving calm under pressure, interpreting it as a monster's detachment. Silas pointed to Victor's increasingly erratic behavior, his desperate need for control, seeing signs of a mind unraveling. The words became weapons, but they were not enough. The tension, stretched to its breaking point, snapped. Victor, convinced he was facing a monster, made the first move. With a roar of rage and desperate certainty, he lunged at Silas, drawing his heavy hunting knife. Silas reacted instantly, his reflexes honed by a lifetime of anticipating danger. He drew his own knife, the thin silver blade glinting in the perpetual twilight. The fight was on, not between man and monster, but between two highly trained, utterly exhausted hunters, each convinced the other was a deadly threat. The clearing became their arena. The fight was fast, brutal, grounded in skill and desperation. Knives flashed, steel ringing against steel. They parried, thrust, dodged, their movements precise despite their fatigue. Victor, heavier and stronger, tried to overpower Silas, driving him back with aggressive attacks. Silas, lighter and faster, relied on agility, weaving and feinting, looking for an opening, his silver blade a lethal extension of his arm. They used the terrain, dodging behind trees, using roots and rocks for cover. It was a dance of death, performed by masters of their craft, stripped down to raw instinct and survival. They were fighting not just for their lives, but for the truth, each absolutely certain the other was the lie that had to be extinguished. They fought with a ferocity born of terror and perceived betrayal, no quarter asked, none given. Throughout this brutal human struggle, Aaron remained where he was, near the dying fire. He did not run. He did not cry out. He simply watched. His head was tilted slightly, following the movements of the two fighting men. The fear on his face lessened, replaced by that same strange, unsettling stillness Victor had glimpsed earlier. His eyes, wide and fixed on the swirling figures of Victor and Silas, held an expression that was not fear, not panic, but a chilling, detached observation. He was a spectator at a performance, one he had anticipated. He did not intervene. He did not make a sound. The clash of their blades, the grunt of effort, the heavy, ragged breathing filled the otherwise silent forest. Victor lunged, attempting a disarming maneuver. Silas sidestepped, whipping his blade in a vicious arc. Victor parried, sparks flying as metal struck metal. They were locked in a desperate final embrace of violence, the culmination of the paranoia that had consumed them. And then, cutting through the sounds of their struggle, a sound that froze them both instantly. A low growl. Deep, guttural, powerful. Not the panting of exhausted men, not the rustle of leaves, not any natural sound of the forest. It was a sound they recognized, a sound that had haunted their nightmares and driven their profession. A werewolf's growl. But this growl was different. Deeper, richer, filled with a terrifying intelligence that went beyond mere animal fury. It resonated in their bones, in the very air. It came from behind them, near the fire, near where Aaron sat watching. Victor and Silas stopped fighting simultaneously, their weapons lowering slowly. Their heads snapped around, eyes wide with a dawning, sickening comprehension. They looked at Aaron. Victor and Silas froze, their bodies locked in the stances of combat, knives still clutched in their hands. The growl, raw and powerful, hung in the air, a chilling sound that eradicated their mutual animosity in a single terrifying instant. It was the sound of a werewolf, unmistakable, yet imbued with a depth and intelligence that sent a fresh wave of ice through their veins. And it had come from there. Their eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, snapped towards Aaron. He was no longer huddled, trembling. He was standing, straightening slowly, his posture losing the slumped defeatedness that had defined him for days. His head was no longer bowed. He held it high, his gaze fixed on them. In the dim light, his eyes were different, wider, reflecting the faint firelight with an unnatural intensity. There was no fear there now, only that same chilling, detached gaze they had glimpsed for fleeting moments. The sound came again, a low, rumbling growl that originated deep within his chest. And then, the change began. It was horrifyingly fast, terrifyingly efficient. Not a slow, painful transformation like the lore described for the newly infected, but a rapid, controlled shift of flesh and bone. A sickening chorus of pops and cracks echoed in the clearing as his bones realigned, reshaping into something larger, denser. His clothes ripped and tore, fabric shredding as muscles swelled and bulged unnaturally beneath his skin. Dark hair, thick and coarse, erupted from his pores, quickly covering his face, neck, and hands. His fingers elongated, twisting and thickening, nails hardening and darkening into wicked claws. His face pushed outwards, the bridge of his nose extending, his jaw stretching forward into a lupine muzzle. His mouth widened, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth, the canines elongating into massive yellowed fangs dripping with saliva. He did not scream in pain. There was no agony in his transformation, only a terrible, focused power. It was the change of a creature that had undergone this metamorphosis many times, a master of its own flesh. In mere seconds, Aaron, the frail, terrified human, was gone. Standing in his place was a monstrous bipedal wolf-like creature. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, its body a mass of coiled muscle under dark matted fur. Its head was pure wolf, long-snouted, with pointed ears swiveling to catch every sound. Its hands were massive paws tipped with bone-white claws. Its legs were bent like a canid's, ending in powerful clawed feet. It was the embodiment of primal terror, infinitely stronger and faster than a man. And its eyes were the most terrifying part. Glowing faintly red in the gloom, they held not the mindless rage of a cornered animal, but a terrible burning intelligence, a chilling malevolence that was undeniably Aaron. The set of its jaw, the tilt of its head, they were distorted, monstrous reflections of the man they had known. This was not just a beast. It was Aaron, transformed into something ancient and hungry. The horrifying truth slammed into Victor and Silas with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from their lungs. Ethan. He was the strongest of them, the most capable in a direct physical confrontation. He would have been the hardest to take down, the greatest threat to a newly transformed or vulnerable creature. Aaron had eliminated him first, brutally, silencing the most dangerous opponent. David. The scholar, the man who knew the lore, who studied the arcane. He was the one most likely to understand the trap, the symbols, the true nature of the creature holding them captive. Aaron had lured him away, killed him with ritualistic symbols carved into his flesh, a message, a signature, a deliberate act to throw suspicion off himself and onto David or Silas. He had eliminated the intellect, the threat of being understood. And the silver? The fragment Victor had found near Silas? A plant. A deliberate piece of misdirection, placed precisely to ignite the simmering distrust between Victor and Silas, to accelerate their descent into paranoia, to ensure they would turn their blades on each other while the real killer waited in the shadows. His weakness, his panic, his constant fear. It had all been a performance. A masterful, chilling deception. The perfect camouflage. No one suspected the sniveling, terrified man. While Victor and Silas dueled with shadows and accusations, the true monster had been among them all along, orchestrating their demise. The creature that had been Aaron threw back its massive head and let out a deafening roar that tore through the silence of the forest, a sound of triumph and unrestrained power that shook the trees. It was a sound of victory, its glowing red eyes fixed on Victor and Silas, and in their depth they saw not just bestial hunger, but understanding, hatred, and a terrible, profound satisfaction. It had planned this. It had won. And then, from the blood-flecked muzzle, came a low, raspy sound, a sound undeniably like distorted laughter. Then a guttural expulsion of air, a sound that shaped itself into something resembling a word, carrying the weight of utter finality, a damning confirmation. Always. The implication was clear. It had been among them from the beginning. A wolf in sheep's clothing, a monster embedded in their very core. They had not killed all the monsters. The most dangerous one had survived, and he had been their comrade, their blind spot all along. The moment of horrifying revelation lasted only an instant, shattered by the monster's triumphant roar. Shock gave way to a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline. Victor and Silas, seasoned hunters to their core, reacted instinctively. Their knives, still in hand from their aborted duel, became their only defense against the nightmare standing before them. Silas. Victor roared, his voice hoarse, a primal sound of rage and despair. He lunged forward, not in a tactical maneuver, but in a reckless act of defiance against the impossible. Silas moved with him, his earlier conflict with Victor forgotten in the face of the true enemy. His silver knife, blessed and sharp, was aimed low, hoping to strike a vital point or inflict a wound that silver would make grievous. The transformed Aaron, the werewolf that had been their comrade, moved with impossible speed and grace. It was a whirlwind of fur, teeth, and claws. The desperate attack of the two men was a futile gesture against its overwhelming power. The fight was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The creature swiped with a massive clawed paw. Silas, attempting to parry with his knife, was simply overwhelmed. Claws the size of dinner knives tore through his defenses. There was a wet tearing sound, a choked gasp. Silas was tossed aside like a rag doll, slammed against a tree trunk with sickening force. He slumped to the ground, unmoving, his silver blade skittering away across the leaf litter. Silas, the silent, lethal tracker, was dead, destroyed in an instant by the monster he and Victor had failed to see. Victor was alone now, the last surviving hunter facing the creature that had been Aaron. Horror warred with a blazing, suicidal fury. He charged, aiming his knife for the monster's chest, a futile thrust against bone and muscle far thicker than any man's. The werewolf, with a speed that defied belief, easily dodged the attack. Its glowing red eyes fixed on Victor, not with blind animal rage, but with that same terrifying intelligence, a cold, calculating hatred. It did not immediately rip him apart, as it had Ethan, or dispatch him with cold efficiency, as it had David. It moved in close, its fetid breath hot on Victor's face. Then its massive jaw opened, revealing those horrific fangs. It did not bite for the throat, not to kill quickly. Instead, it clamped down on Victor's sword arm, the one not holding the knife, just above the elbow. Pain exploded through Victor's limb, a searing, agonizing burn, unlike any wound he had ever sustained. The fangs tore through muscle and sinew, but the bite was not meant to sever. It was deep, ragged, designed to maim, to infect. He felt the piercing puncture wounds, the tearing of flesh, and something else. A burning sensation that spread rapidly from the wound, a feeling of poison injecting itself into his bloodstream. Victor cried out, dropping his knife as his arm went numb, then erupted in fire. The werewolf released him, stepping back. It did not follow up the attack. It stood for a moment, looming over Victor, who had crumpled to the ground, clutching his savaged arm. The creature's red eyes bored into his soul, filled with a chilling mixture of triumph and expectation. It had achieved its goal with Victor. With a final resonant growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the trapped forest, the monster turned and melted back into the perpetual gloom of the trees. It disappeared as silently as Silas had always moved, leaving Victor alone in the clearing, writhing in agony. Just before it vanished, Victor heard that low, raspy sound again, that terrible mockery of laughter, fading into the oppressive silence. Victor lay on the damp earth, pain radiating from his arm, his mind reeling from the horror, the betrayal, the utter defeat. He was the last one. The monster had won. It had destroyed his team, revealed its true nature, and escaped back into the darkness of the trap that held them. But the horror was not over. The burning in his arm intensified, spreading through his chest, his body. It was not just the pain of a wound. It was a profound internal restructuring. A sickening symphony of pops and cracks began in his bones, echoing the sounds he had just heard Aaron make. His muscles began to knot and cramp, contracting violently. His skin felt like it was simultaneously on fire and being stretched thin, about to tear. A terrifying, uncontrollable surge of power coursed through him, overriding his pain, overriding his consciousness. He arched his back, a guttural sound tearing from his throat, a sound that was half human scream, half something monstrous. His vision blurred, red seeping into the edges of his sight. Thought became difficult, then impossible, replaced by a rising tide of instinct, of rage, of an all-consuming hunger. Victor, the leader, the hunter, writhed on the ground, his body rapidly transforming into the very thing he had hunted his entire life. The trap remained unbroken, the forest silent and indifferent around him. The circle was closed. The monster had not only killed the hunters, it had created another. Victor was no longer Victor. He was the newest creature trapped within the woods, forever bound to the place of his defeat, a terrifying new denizen of the invisible cage, a living testament to the monster who had won.